WNYC Studios is supported by Bard Graduate Programs in Sustainability, offering degrees in sustainable business, climate policy, and environmental education with hybrid and on-campus options. Apply by May 1st for fall enrollment at gps.bard.edu. WNYC Studios is supported by the Met. Now on view, Jacques-Louis David, Radical Draftsman. Drawings and sketches reveal the creative process behind David's iconic paintings. Learn more at metmuseum.org.
The world has changed. 13 Ukrainian border guards on a tiny island in the Black Sea responded to a demand to surrender by saying, "Go yourselves." Ukrainian President Zelensky became a global hero.
Президент тут. Всі ми тут. Захисникам. Слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні. Слава.
Elon Musk responded to a Ukrainian request for assistance by making the Starlink satellite broadband service available in Ukraine. Multiple states and many businesses across the U.S. pulled Russian-made vodka from their shelves. Russian assets are frozen across the globe. Their state media is blocked. The European Union, for the first time, is funding the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. And in response to it all, Vladimir Putin has escalated, ordering Russian nuclear deterrent forces put on high alert. I'm Melissa Harris-Perry, and today on The Takeaway, we begin in a world utterly altered by the events of the last few days. And we ask, what happens next? With me now is Nina Khrushcheva, who is a professor of international affairs at the New School in New York and great-granddaughter of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Thank you so much for being here, Nina.
Thank you very much. What a sad, sad time.
It truly is. So on Sunday, we learned that Ukraine and Russia will hold talks at the Belarus border. But what is there to talk about?
Well, it is very unclear what this talks about because, first of all, the Russian delegation doesn't seem to be of very high level. They don't seem to be great experts on this kind of talk, so we don't know what their mandate is. And it is possible, and I hope I'm wrong, but it is possible it's just one of those Vladimir Putin's tricks to pretend that he's doing everything to de-escalate, but instead to escalate and then blame everybody else around him for the further developments.
So as you talk there about Vladimir Putin, I'm reminded you and I used to have conversations fairly regularly, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. And I can remember you always saying, you need to understand what Vladimir Putin is not operating with the same kinds of rational incentive structures as, we can presume relative to other global leaders. And I can remember thinking, I think Nina is maybe like overstating this, but not so much. Can you help me to understand the ways in which what you've been saying now, genuinely for a decade, at least to me, has manifest on this global stage?
Well, I wish I were this time around. I wish I were much more forceful in saying that we are dealing with a nutty person, because this time I kind of learned to explain and understand his kind of despotic idiosyncrasies. Why would he react to certain things? And when for 3 months there've been a conversation about Russia attacking Ukraine, and sort of everybody, at least everybody I talk to, any analyst, and not an alarmist, but an analyst, would say, well, this is so against Russian national interest, so it's just not possible. Mm-hmm. And I stopped when he recognized the breakaway republics first of Donetsk and Luhansk. I thought that's what he stopped, because there would be a proportional response to American-owned escalation of rhetoric and continue sort of backing him into the corner, saying, well, you're going to attack and we're not going to let you. Because once you deal with a despot, with an autocrat, usually when they are doubted or when they're undermined, of course, they would lash off. And that's what Putin did when I first started talking to you in 2014 after the Crimea annexation. And this time it seems to be really now on the level of a megalomaniac, of Stalin-esque, Mao-esque proportions. So his behavior really didn't change, but it does seem that with attacking Ukraine, with invading Ukraine, he is no longer even thinking in political terms, global political terms, what's useful, what's not useful. He's thinking like all megalomaniacs about his pet peeves. And when I look at Kiev, the what is being bombed by the Russians, by my people, Nikita Khrushchev lovingly restored it after World War II, and now another Russian leader is bombing it to pieces. That's heartbreaking. It's just, it doesn't have words to even explain how the Russians feel about the war. It's not, I mean, horrible for Ukrainians, but the Russians are crying because it is their brothers, and we're killing our brothers.
That perspective, I think, is a challenging one for us, sitting on the global stage, watching from the outside, this language of a loving restoration and then a destruction. So what do you think is happening in Putin's understanding of what he is doing relative to Russian interests, given what you've just told us?
Well, and that's what I'm thinking of Mao and, all other great dictators, so to speak. It's no longer about national interests, about their own legacy. And I think that it went that nutty that it seems, I can't really analyze a madman anymore, because it does seem that anytime when there is an opportunity for him to think about the world, about brothers, that Ukrainians, he talked about so much, that we are the same nation and therefore we need to protect them against their, by the way, Jewish president who Putin calls a Nazi. That it's just such an Orwellian war is peace, ignorance in strengths, and so on and so forth. So it just completely makes no sense whatsoever. But the way Putin sees it, I think he's recreating some sort of pan-Slavic state, Slavic brotherhood of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And that's how he's going to go into history, by being known as the uniter of the Slavic lands, which, by the way, was originally idea introduced by first Russian philosophers, sort of conservative Russian philosophers, but also by Putin's beloved writer, beloved philosopher and nationalist Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who we know is the spokesperson, as a writer against Gulag, but also he was a very serious nationalist. But for Solzhenitsyn, that was a philosophy. For Putin, it is a reality. And what is happening, I think, instead of creating that empire that Slavic empire that he so willingly now put the world in danger for, it probably will result in what Afghanistan was for the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union sort of expanded its Soviet empire, went into 79 into Afghanistan, got out of there in 89 and collapsed a few years later. So it does seem that this kind of expansions clearly damage the Russian Empire, which still exists, because that's what there's some territories that are still imperial, and Putin feels of himself as that kind of legacy of an empire. So instead of expanding it as those leaders want, they actually diminishing their capacity and our capacity for rational existence. So it's going to end really badly, I think, not only because that war is such a stain, it's such a shame for the Russians. We apologize all the time. There are protests in Moscow, people are being taken into detention and they scream, "Позор, позор." It's shame on the country, it's shame on every Russian. And I think the result of it will be what Afghanistan was in 89. But the result of it is also going to be very, very horrible, because empires don't collapse in peace. Unfortunately, they collapse with pain and blood and horror. But Putin feels now that all this blood and horror will be forgotten, because in history, 100 years from now, the great Vladimir Putin, Putin the First, will be known as that uniter of all the Slavs on the former, sort of on the Slavic original territory.
Your point about Afghanistan, I want to dig in here for a moment, because that sense that this could be, as Afghanistan was for the Soviet Union, the global response, almost immediate global response here, though, is quite different. And this sense of, I hear what sounds like a kind of madman, reconnection of the Slavic people. But I will say it does seem to have unleashed a certain kind of although over and against himself and his own decision-making, a kind of global responsiveness to the people of Ukraine that is quite different than what we've seen when the nation being invaded for imperial purposes was not a European brother, was not a Slavic neighbor. And I wonder what you make of this response. Is this about the world learning and doing better than the globe did in the context of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan? Or is this about a kind of global whiteness?
Well, I hate to say it. I think it is not to undermine and diminish the Ukrainian suffering and our shame, the Russian shame for doing this. I think it is the global whiteness. It is the country in Europe that, after the United States so shamefully, I think, withdrew from Afghanistan and kind of dropped the coalition of the willing, and everybody slightly stunned. And now they're all up in arms in defense of the country in Europe. Not that they don't have to be, but those warnings, leave immediately, go away from Kiev, and so on. I wish this kind of calls were done so loudly in Afghanistan, and they were not. Also, if you see, as you see, the refugees from Ukraine are being treated very differently from the ones that go from Syria, from Iraq, from Iran. Once again, this is nothing to say of Ukrainians and their struggle, but I think the global response is certainly different, because it does seem that historically Europe and America respond differently to the white nation in peril, the European nation in peril, than the nation elsewhere. And you're right, in Afghanistan, there was a different response, and it was not a close neighbor because, of course, Afghanistan is further away. And that's why what Putin does is more horrible, because he keeps saying these are the brothers, and the world's response is wonderful. But of course, one would say that it's not devoid of certain hypocrisy, of certain white country, white man, white mentality hypocrisy. Even if Kyiv falls, even if the Russian forces can sort of maintain control of some portion of the land, can you hold a country can you actually expand an empire into a place that is resisting at this level? That's why I couldn't believe, nobody could believe until the last minute that he would do it. Because, and I kept saying it myself, is that what is he going to, these are the people that got destroyed. I mean, this is the country that, then the Soviet Republic, the country was destroyed almost more than anything during World War II. I mean, it was demolished, it was deleted. And they fought like hell, and expecting that the Ukrainians today that hate Putin's guts since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea and the early battles for Ukraine, then when he was trying to annex parts at that time, that they are not going to fight, especially when it was in order to give Ukrainians guns and armament to fight the Russians. I don't understand what was in his head.
Nina Khrushcheva is professor of international affairs at the New School in New York City and the great-granddaughter of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Nina, as always, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have more on Ukraine next as we talk a bit about the rules of urban warfare. It's The Takeaway.
WNYC Studios is supported by BARD graduate programs in sustainability, offering degrees in sustainable business, climate policy, and environmental education with hybrid and on-campus options. BARD educates future business and nonprofit leaders to innovate solutions to critical social, environmental, and economic challenges to create a more just, sustainable future. Applications due May 1st for fall enrollment. gps.bard.edu. WNYC Studios is supported by Grubhub. Sometimes getting to a so-called convenience store isn't actually very convenient. But now Grubhub delivers from local convenience stores. Whether you're in the market for snacks, paper towels, or drinks, Grubhub delivers them right from the convenience store to your door. It's delivery, it's convenience, it's deliverience. Or just call it Grubhub.
Here's another podcast you may enjoy: This Day in Esoteric Political History, part of the Radiotopia Network from PRX. Look, we are living in what can feel like unprecedented times, which is why a lot of us are turning to history for clues or just a good story. 3 times a week, the This Day crew, that's me, Jody Avirgan, and historians Kelly Jackson and Nicole Hemmer, pick a moment, famous, forgotten, epic, and weird, and talk about what it all means. It's also short, and it's also fun. Listen to This Day in Esoteric Political History wherever you get your podcasts.
This is The Takeaway. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and we're continuing our coverage of Russia's ongoing attacks on Ukraine and focusing in on the military tactics currently being used by both Russia and Ukraine. Russia has mounted attacks into at least 3 different regions of the country and now its 2 largest cities. With me now is Earl Catagnus Jr., an adjunct professor in security and risk analysis at Penn State University, Brandywine, an editorial board member for Marine Corps University Press. He's also a decorated former Marine Scout sniper. Earl, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Melissa.
So Russia's government is reportedly surprised by the level of resistance that they've encountered in Ukraine. And I think much of the world, the globe, seems to be responding with a kind of surprise and obviously a lot of global support. But I'm wondering if, for all of the social media enthusiasm about this, is it possible for a small, mostly civilian group like this to truly hold off Russian troops?
So it depends on the resolve of the Putin and what he ultimately is trying to do and what his objective is. What you see is negotiations that are going on in the background. That might have been already part of his plan to try to force the Ukrainians to a position where they have to negotiate, and particularly taking NATO membership off the table, which was his stated goal. But that is all about slowly stopping the Russian offensive and delaying it. There is an inevitability of this. If Russia decides to invest as much resources to take a city, a mega city like Kiev, that it is inevitable, but it may be months and months and months. If they delay, the civilian force could delay, the guerrillas could delay the Russian army that long. But what I think you see happening is that overall Putin's stated goal, where he said to demilitarize and to denazify. And those are 2 terms that we kind of brushed off and have long since tried to listen to what Putin says, because he pretty much tells you what he wants. And so that what he's talking about with denazification is taking the political leadership out of the game for Ukraine. And he may be successful at doing that if he can kill them or push them into exile. So if he can do that, then his goal is met and he can walk away winning, because for him, it's not about winning in the world. It's the reality on the ground, and that he is literally taken Ukrainian membership out of NATO off the table, and demilitarization, that Ukraine cannot put up a fight for a decade or so against the Russian incursion if they had to. So that's what his ultimate goal is, and Ukraine will hold out. And you notice that he's not attempting to occupy the entire country, and has stated that. So this is purely why he called it a special military operation, not only the legal consequences of using that term instead of invasion, but he has very specific political objectives to accomplish. And it remains to be seen how well he does that in the coming days and weeks.
Okay, I want you to dig into this with me just a bit so that I can be sure I understand what you're saying. So much of the world has responded to the language of Nazi, right, to the denazification, and pointing out that Zelensky, that to call him a Nazi, given that he is the child of, and grandchild of survivors, is the problem. But what you're saying is listen to what it is that Putin is saying about his goal rather than the discourse. Is that right? That what he's saying is, for him, he can declare a win, not by holding Ukraine, but by removing this leadership. Is that what I hear you saying?
That's exactly right. So the reason why he chose denazification, one, it's a term, whenever you use Nazi, it immediately sparks up an emotional, an emotive response. So, but what he's saying is it's the leadership. He's trying to separate the people from the leadership, the Ukrainian leadership. And then when he uses Nazi, he is invoking. So in the United States, or it's not real. The Holocaust was real, but they don't feel it. They don't feel feel as a population a historical feeling of it. That Europe does, particularly Ukraine, and some of the guilt that Ukraine as a people feel for their participation in the Holocaust. So when he's doing that, it's a signal to the Ukrainian people. Again, it's not going to be effective overtly, but covertly, it hits at deep feelings of shame of what they did. And so when he says it, again, it has nothing to do with that there's actually going to be an overthrow because they believe that the political leadership is Nazi. But in combination with this, it's a long-term discourse that he and the Russians will then use to legitimize their actions. But it's the reality is they just want to get rid of the leadership and install a Russian, not necessarily a puppet. I don't even think that Putin even cares whether this leadership is effective, if he does get rid of the current Ukrainian leadership. It's just about trying to make Ukraine benign in that it cannot exert any type of influence on Russian affairs.
Talk to me about similarities or dissimilarities that you see here with any of the recent wars in the Middle East, especially strategically. So when you're talking about the inevitability of Kyiv eventually falling, even if it's weeks or months later.
So if this was World War II, you would see massive destruction of property. And that is one of the surprising things that most times when Russia does invade, like if you look at Grozny in the 90s in Chechnya, if you look at Georgia, there was no holding back on destruction of civilian property. The Russian juggernaut just went through and swept through. So what is surprising is that there is, even though there are civilian casualties, but for the Russians, there's not that much. And the strikes that you do see are very surgical in a Russian sense, not necessarily in our sense. But because the way that they do enter in cities and the way they have historically not cared and just crushed an entire city block by block, it is surprising to see. But this is not going to be where the Russians are going to go block by block. But they just can't, unless they're willing to incur massive casualties. So what you'll see is that there will be eventually a time where the leadership, their focus is on the leadership. They can get the leadership to run, or if they can take them out, then the population will just will just go with it. But the goal is that they may not even have to go into Kiev. If they can force through negotiation Zelensky to agree that NATO membership is off the table, and if they can force through negotiation that EU membership might be years later, or if they can actually take him out or force him to leave, then he wins and they don't have to go all the way in. So that's why I think you see that you'll see raiding parties going into the city to test it, to see what's going on. So you'll also see that there are special operations forces and intelligence operatives all throughout Kiev that have been infiltrated in for months in advance. So they're there to locate targets. They're there to do route guidance for when the Russian troops go in. They're there to assault with the attack force if they get an opportunity to do so. We have not seen massive assassinations or elimination of high-value targets from them. And that might be because the Ukrainians know that there's a mark on their head and they're hiding well, or that plan hasn't been a go order yet.
Earl Catagnus Jr. is adjunct professor in security and risk analysis at Penn State University Brandywine. As always, thank you for joining us, Earl.
Thank you, Melissa.
I'm David Remnick, and each week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, my colleagues and I unpack what's happening in a very complicated world. You'll hear from the New Yorker's award-winning reporters and thinkers, Jelani Cobb on race and justice, Jill Lepore on American history, Vincent Cunningham and Gia Tolentino on culture, Bill McKibben on climate change, and many more. So please never miss an episode. Listen to the New Yorker Radio Hour wherever you get your podcasts.